What's going on, ladies and gentlemen? It's me, Hasan Piker, the prodigal son. This is my show called Agitprop, short for agitative propaganda. This is a show that is going to center around a more leftist perspective on the comings and goings and daily monotony of news. My first episode is one that some of you have been waiting for. It is with Cenk Uygur, the founder, the host, a person I'm related to by blood. He will be here defending capitalism. So yeah, just before we get started on that, how do you feel?
I feel good. Look, we're related by blood, but blood might be spilled tonight.
Oh, jeez. Okay. I didn't want to hype it up too much because, like, I'm not going to go super hard on you, and I'm not going to go super hard on like theory or whatever. Look, I'm not a very smart guy. I'm like a common sense, reasonable dude. So that's what this show is mostly going to be about. And then also we're gonna offer some historical context to the things that are ongoing, the problems that are ongoing in contemporary society. So.
Yeah, so let me just say, kidding aside, look, I'm sure that we will agree on plenty of things. And it's a real debate / discussion. So in the past, I've had a discussion with Sam Harris that turned into a debate, right? And then there's been debates that I've had that turned into discussions, like with Tucker Carlson. And then I've had debates that were just debates. But here I'm positive that we're gonna agree on a lot of stuff, but there's gonna be stuff that we obviously disagree on, and that's why we're doing this. But also, he's both being patronizing to me by saying he'll take it easy on me, but also being needlessly humble because he's read a lot of the literature here, more than I have. So it'll be interesting to see how it goes.
I don't know. I'm a little worried about my my financial security and my job security at the company. So no, I will be. Well, that's actually literally what we're gonna be talking about. So before we get into this, okay, before we get into the debate, I want you to lay out your position as best as you possibly can, because you have said time and time again, kind of like Elizabeth Warren, that you are a capitalist. Right,
yeah,
you are a capitalist,
right.
and I am more. I wouldn't say even in the Bernie camp. I would say I'm further left than Bernie, but I am firmly anti-capitalist. So I would like to understand exactly what your political philosophy is. Yeah. I would assume that you are a social democrat, right?
Yeah. So look, I love that you're starting with that because a lot of this is wordplay, and so. I support Elizabeth Warren. I also support Bernie Sanders.
Of course.
So 100%. So. And one calls themselves a capitalist, the other one democratic socialist. Who cares? To me, it doesn't matter at all. What matters is their policies, and I love their policies. There's there might be shades of disagreement here and there on both sides, but overall, if you follow those people and you agree with them, then you largely probably agree with me. So in terms of why I call myself a capitalist is because I believe in incentives and disincentives. I believe in the free market. Now, at the same time. What we have now in America is not ideal capitalism, to say the least. That is a massive, massive understatement. So it's been greatly perverted, mainly by money in politics, but really what it spawned is what I would call corporatism. And I am 1,000,000,000% against corporatism. And so as we talk throughout these 2 hours here, I'll explain the distinction between corporatism and capitalism and why they're actually fundamentally opposed to one another. So I believe that the state has a role in some of the industries, obviously police, firefighters. I also think the state has a role in health insurance. And it's just a matter of where you draw the line. But I don't believe the state has a role in making sneakers or jeans or hamburgers. So that's my rough layman's distinction there.
Okay, interesting. Now, my POV is that we completely agree on the short-term goals. I have no problem building a coalition with social democrats. I think it's an absolute necessity that we should do that. That's part of the show. That's literally what we're going to be talking about here. But I think that the fundamentals are different. Where I the premises where I drive my main conclusions from are fundamentally different than yours, even though our short-term goals are basically the same. And I genuinely believe that if I were to describe this to you, our long-term goals would probably be the same as well.
Well, we're going to find out.
What I mean by that is, my understanding is that I look at this from a materialist perspective. I look at commodity production from a materialist perspective, and I believe that there are fundamental flaws within the capitalist organization of the economy that make it virtually impossible to reform, and that state reforms ultimately will erode, and history has shown this over and over again, which is why I want to ask you my first question. But before we get to the first question, I forgot that I need to do a promo. This is my first ever live show, so I'm really sorry. TYT members, you guys can watch the full debate uninterrupted and on demand, okay? If you're not a member yet, you can sign up at tyt.com/agitprop so that you don't have to miss a single part of this debate, because the second hour of this is going to be behind a paywall, because this is a capitalist institution after all, and I am simply a humble worker. So, back to the question I have for you after I gave that.
That's his way of saying I made that decision.
Yeah, this is back to the question I have for you though. Why do you think capitalism can be reformed when you observe and admit to all of the problems under a capitalist system, and that history has shown that all of these state reforms will be eroded ultimately?
Yeah. No, so I actually think it depends. Depends on what period of time you're looking at and what the socio-political context was. So for example, right now, why are we in disastrous shape and capitalism has run amok, et cetera? It's mainly because corporatism took over. So what's corporatism? It is rule by corporations. Now, a lot of people mistake that and thinking, well, that's capitalism, isn't it? No, because once corporations are born, they're kind of like Oedipus. They immediately want to kill their dad, capitalism. Why? Because they don't want free markets. They want monopoly power as much as humanly possible. They will then go to screw over their mom. Is another word for that. And their mom is democracy. So they will try to capture the government to limit competition and kill free markets so that they don't have to bother making a good product. They just do government capture. And it actually is a very efficient way to maximize your profits, but it kills off capitalism in the meanwhile. So that's the state we're in now, because our Supreme Court allowed for corporations to spend unlimited money buying our government. That's the independent expenditures and the campaign donations. So on the other hand, in America, we actually, and of course, look, all this is rough, right? Because now I'm gonna tell you that we actually did have capitalism in America, but look, it was heavily tinged with socialism that FDR pushed, right? So Social Security could be argued to be obviously a form of socialism, right? It is the state helping you to save money for retirement. And I think that is the right role for the state. That's where I would say, yes, that's on the state side, not on the free market side. But from FDR to 1978, when the Supreme Court said you can spend unlimited money in politics, we roughly had capitalism in this country, and our life expectancy went up, our health went up, our income went up, every living standard went up. So, and I can show you different examples throughout the world where capitalism has worked.
So that's really interesting, and I think that's precisely why we need to go back to the fundamentals a little bit, and I need to bring in a concept here and get your perspective on this concept, which is class antagonism, the friction between the worker class and the owners, because I think that this is a fundamental that a lot of social democrats miss, and it is at the heart of all of the inequality inside of this system, because the system and every institution that is propped up within this system is designed to legitimize capitalism itself, from our institutions of higher learning to even the police force, all the way to our media, as you would probably admit. So what is that class antagonism? It's the dichotomy between you and I, the divergence of your interests versus mine. You are my boss. You want me to work the most amount of hours for the least amount of pay. I am your worker. I need to work I want to work the least amount of hours for the most amount of pay. Now, obviously, through this process of negotiations, you oftentimes come out on top because you have more wealth. Whether you secured it through intergenerational wealth, or because you got lucky, or a series of probability, or even because you worked really hard and then you got lucky on top of that. But ultimately, you have a concentration of wealth and power at the top, and this allows you to tell me, look, no matter how much you want to get paid, I still make these rules, and that I'm still going to pay you less than what you put out for me. I'm going to pay you less than your output. That is profit. What do you do with that? That would be considered surplus value that I give you, and that you take and do whatever you want with. This is the fundamental flaw within the capitalist structure. And then what you do with those profits, or what historically has been done with those profits, is the bosses will go and design and build these institutions that then legitimize the same economic organization. So that is why we have this erosion of all of the reforms that you have mentioned before. No matter how hard we fight for them, we ultimately still get those same erosions. And also, historically, this system at every single step of the way has always benefited the interests of owners of capital, whether it be from our founding fathers, George Washington, who literally used a loophole to switch out his slaves every 6 months in an effort to make sure that he doesn't have to free them, all the way to numerous Supreme Court, numerous Supreme Court decisions in which the labor power has been eroded, even during the time that you referenced between 1919 and 1978.
Right. So there's a lot of things in there. Let me try to take them one by one. So first of all, what do you do with profit, and is it by definition exploitation? Well, a couple of points within that. First of all, I didn't always run a company. Obviously, I worked for other people for a lot of my life, and when I did, I hope I didn't work as least as possible and try to take it as much as possible. Look, of course, everybody wants to get paid as much as possible. That's like that we can all agree on.
Well, that's the fundamental interest that you have, obviously,
right,
is to have as much free time as you can to better yourself or do things. That's true liberty, would you not say?
Not necessarily, no, because I liked my work and I believed that the way to rise up was to work harder within that structure, and I was right. And so if it was truly exploitive, wouldn't matter how hard you worked, you wouldn't rise up and you wouldn't get promotions or raises or any of those things. And then you would just have true exploitation, in which case I would agree with you. So let's say we're in a factory in China, we're making iPhones and you're not gonna rise up, okay? There's no rising up. So if I work 11 hours or 12 hours, well, of course I'd rather work 11 hours. Who wants to work 12 hours if there's no opportunity at the end of it, right? But in my case, for example, when I worked at a television station in Miami, the system did work. I came in as the lowest salesperson on staff, kind of like you did here, right?
Yeah.
And kind of like you did here, I rose up. And I wound up going on air. I wound up then becoming a senior producer, then a supervising producer, head writer, and I moved on up. And so that hard work was rewarded. If it wasn't rewarded, then you would be totally right. But in this, it's not like capitalists are stupid, right? They understand that, hey, if all you do is exploit, and I'm not saying there's no exploitation. Of course there's exploitation, right? But if all you do is, and it depends on the company, it depends on a lot of different things. But if that's all you do, then your workers will not be very productive. Like they'll only do the minimum possible. So, so are you in China? Are you in a factory? Are you in a place where there's actually ideas? Is there real mobility, et cetera? So that's why I say I don't readily accept that formula as just the fact.
I didn't want to get into like the fundamentals, and I still want to avoid them as best as possible because they're incredibly boring. But the descriptions that I laid out are objective analysis of how remuneration occurs under capitalism. And what I mean by that is it sounds hyperbolic or it sounds explicit when I say exploitation because there is a colloquial understanding of what exploitation is. But what I'm referencing in this instance is, look, if my output to the company is, let's say, 30 units, you're gonna pay me back 24 units because that's how it goes. That's
okay. So let's tackle that. So that's the next part, right?
And I'm not saying that like upward social mobility is impossible, but and it certainly isn't. Obviously, there are still people who can rise up and move from like middle class to upper middle class or whatnot. But ultimately, for the large majority of people that exist on this planet, both domestically and also at the international scale, that kind of class change is not necessarily a reality. And it's not just about hard work, and it's more so about a lack of equality of opportunity even, and that is all a consequence of a system that has designed itself to concentrate wealth and power at the top, so that every institution that comes after that is working at the behest of those capital owners.
So a couple things about that. First of all, that's why my political philosophy emphasizes opportunity at every turn. So when we did the Progressive Economic Pledge on the Young Turks, and we asked politicians to sign it, College for All is on there. And so that was the one that was actually, in a sense, the most controversial, because it was supposed to be kind of a bare minimum litmus test of whether you're a progressive. People were like, well, is that really part of the bare minimum, College for All? And my answer is yes, because it provides opportunity for people who might not have it, and that gets the class mobility. Now, that's informed by our family's history. So my dad, your grandfather, was literally a dirt poor farmer and would have stayed on that farm for the rest of his life if he didn't have a chance at a free college education, which he got not in America, but in Turkey, which actually has a slightly more socialist system. And so it's just, that's why I say it's a matter where you draw the lines. So we must have class mobility. That doesn't mean that we do currently in America. Class mobility has been basically shrunken down at every turn, and it is by the controlling class, the donor class in America, and their greed knows no bounds, and so they burn the bridge after they cross it. So, but you can obviously have a system, as Turkey does, as most of Europe does, and as America had for a long time, where you do have far more class mobility, and the levers of power that the government uses creates that mobility. And so the government is supposed to be our representatives. Right now, it's so perverted in America that they make it seem like the government is supposed to be representing big business. No, it's supposed to represent us, oftentimes against big business.
Can you point to a period in time ever throughout the history of capitalist nations where the government has actually represented the interests of the people at every step of the way, and has done it without any sort of like outsized pressure from militant labor movements, for example,
right,
and trade unionists and communists and socialists agitating and engaging in militant direct action?
So I want to get back to profit a little later, because I think you brought that point up, and it's really important to clarify why there's profit, et cetera, right? And why it's necessary. But in terms of the government and your question there, first of all, there's never a perfect system, but has there been a better balancing act in the past? Absolutely.
No,
right?
That's not what I asked. My question specifically was, you say that the fundamental role of the government is to reform capitalism, is to make sure that there are checks and balances instituted to dial back capitalism when the greedy corporatists, in your words, and their boundless greed gets out of control, and we start exploiting too much. Like a little bit of exploitation is understandable, but too much exploitation, well, then you run into some problems. And my point is, that has never occurred. Like that government that you speak of has never occurred without labor militancy, collective bargaining agreements, and political action taken directly by the people that were more class conscious back when there was trade unions and like the Socialist Party and whatnot in American history, that have been able to push the government to actually do this.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, that's still, again, been scaled back tremendously. And even at that time, even the New Deal era, like there were still, it still obviously did not perfect the system, because it's still susceptible to corruption, it's malleable.
That's right. So a lot of that is totally correct. But in a democracy, a government is a bit of a balancing act. It's always a balancing act. So that's why I brought that up. So what do I mean by that in this context? So FDR had tremendous pressure from labor unions, and people kind of have whitewashed that history.
Of course.
And there was a real significant threat of communism, although you might not perceive it as a threat, but in America at that time, and people forget that.
And fascism.
Right, and fascism, no question. And so what FDR did was a very smart and strong and aggressive balancing of those competing interests in the country, and came out more on the left side because the left side was stronger. And so but that is kind of how government is supposed to work. It's not just that the elected official does it out of the goodness of his heart. He responds to pressure from the public. In a system that's broken like we have today, our politicians do not respond to pressure from the public. So for example, I could use 1,000 examples, but the one I use most often is federal background checks on guns. 97% approval, yet we don't have it in force right now, and that's because we don't have a democracy. Mitch McConnell doesn't care what his voters think at all, not 1%, because he gets elected by the donors, not the voters. That he just accumulates that money, spends it on campaign ads to lie to his voters and pretend that he's actually a leftist. That's literally what he does to win elections. And then not on social issues, but on economic issues. But back in the day, there was pressure, and the pressure did help to get us to a better place. And for LBJ, now this is not an economic issue as much, but the Civil Rights Act, people, you think that just happened on its own? No, not only enormous pressure from Martin Luther King and the nonviolence movement, but honestly, pressure from Malcolm X and pressure from riots in the cities. And we know for a fact now, historically, that LBJ was really, really worried about riots taking over the country. And so that's an uncomfortable fact, but that's a fact regardless. Now, they also have pressure from moneyed interests. So big business will put on pressure, and you name it, every part of society puts on pressure. That's actually a fairly good functioning democracy, as opposed to where we have now, where there's only one pressure point.
Okay, but you keep missing my point, and that is that since our founding in the United States, throughout time, these people that we have elected into positions of power have always been interested in preserving capital interest and capital accumulation at the top as best as possible. And only through labor militancy or direct action or like the threat of riots in the streets have we been able to institute like modest reforms on this system itself. And I say that is a consequence of the fundamentals that I brought forward, that class antagonism, and the fact that this system is entirely designed to collectivize capital at the top, concentrate capital at the top, so that only through the threat of violence can we get some modest reforms, whether it be like equality.
No, I don't agree.
Or even Social Security.
Yeah.
And even then, it's still under threat constantly. It's still constantly scrutinized. Think about how we had to grovel and beg and go to town halls and yell at Republicans at town halls because Donald Trump was like, no, I'm taking it away. I'm taking Obamacare. We're gonna repeal it without a replacement. And like, think about how much activism had to be done just to preserve that system that many people still understand is functionally broken or fundamentally still preserving the interests of private insurance industries, which you and I fight against and try to reform and socialize as best as possible. Think about the amount of work that is a necessity. That's not how democracy should be run. My point is, if we were to actually run this democracy, it would have to be in a way where the results allow every American citizen to have more political autonomy and more political agency. We're gonna talk about that more, but first we have to go to a break. All right, we're back. Sorry about that, everybody. We had to work through a minor little kink there. We have hopefully synchronized the audio and we're back. And you can actually find the full programming for members. It's not going to be desynced on the VOD later on, so don't worry about that. If you were like, damn, I really wanted to see all of the points that Hasan made that were brilliant, you'll be able to see that completely synchronized in the VOD.
Yeah, and by the way, so you can get it by becoming a member, but make sure you do it, if you're gonna become a member, bless your heart, do it through tyt.com/agitprop so that we know you did it through this show, that's what got you excited and interested.
Yeah,
right.
So they know that I am worthwhile to the company and the show is worthwhile and they wanna keep it. Get it? Again, okay. So let's get back to it. I asked you-
capitalist pig.
Yeah, so I asked you a very simple question where I said, why do you think that we've ever had a democracy, or why do you think that this is the best form of democracy when people have to literally either beg in the streets to preserve programs, like social programs that they know aren't even getting the job done completely, or even have to fight in the streets to get civil liberty, for example.
Right. So look, again, we always have to distinguish between today and portions of America and different countries when it worked better, not perfect, but better, right? So today, there's only a couple of honest representatives and democracy left. But let's take that as an example. So that's an interesting different. It's a little bubble within the mass corruption that exists today. So for example, the Just Democrats, none of them take corporate PAC money, and so they're uncorrupted. So, but does that mean that they will just do exactly what their voters want? I hope so, and I think that they've done a million times better job, and it's kind of enlightening. Put a spotlight on, ironically, the rest of the corruption. Like, whoa, if we had honest representatives, it turns out they fight for us instead of big business, et cetera. But even they have different pressures. So they have the pressure of their colleagues. They have the pressure of maybe small businesses in their neighborhood. They have a thousand different points, but that's how it should be in a democracy. So it's never going to be clean like, okay, the only people that the representatives are going to care about are the middle class or poor people. No, they're going to care about all the different classes and all the different interests, and that there's nothing wrong with that. And in terms of the friction, I don't think that there necessarily has to be this friction between the classes. I know that historically, certainly there has been, and I get why it naturally exists, because some portion of the rich will be greedy, and so they'll want more and more and more. And since they already have a lot of wealth and power, they will then use that wealth and power to accumulate more. But even today, even in this broken system, when you ask millionaires, should taxes be raised? 60% of them, the majority of the upper class says, yes, my taxes should be raised. So that's an example of there doesn't always have to be class warfare or friction. And the classes are not uniform. They're not just one blob. It's not like, oh, eat the rich. No, it depends which rich, and don't eat anybody. Okay, but you see what I'm saying?
Okay, here's the issue here. What you simply are just failing to recognize is when I mention class antagonism, it's not in the extremities that you talk of. It's in every single aspect of our lives. And maybe you might have forgotten that as someone who is now a boss and a capital owner who works in a company. But at some point, as you noted, you used to be a worker and you were a hard worker, and that's great. And I admire that. I'm a hard worker too. We have less alienation. We obviously benefit from a tremendous amount of privilege. As you said, your father, my grandfather, he built out this affluent. I mean, he was affluent. He gave you affluent beginnings so that you could go to college and go to the best institutions and have financial security and freedom to be able to pursue your dream, even if it meant literally living in like a motel in Miami for an extended period of time. But you still had some form of security. For a lot of people, they do not have that at all. There is no chance of upwards socioeconomic mobility at all. And for the overwhelming majority, again, I have to repeat this over and over again, for the overwhelming majority of people, the reality is they're not actually able to pursue their dreams, or they're not actually able to take on a job that's different than one that is unfulfilling. And you know this, and I know this, and that's precisely what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the common American and worldwide story for everyday workers and the struggles that they go through. When I say class antagonism and you bring it back to a personal anecdote, it's a little difficult to have this conversation. It's great that you want to work hard, and I work very hard as well. Totally great, totally valid. But the reality is a lot of people work really hard. Most of the people work really hard, and it's not just about upwards class mobility, it's about the lack of political agency that they have, the lack of political autonomy that they have, the lack of wealth that they have to pursue whatever they want to pursue. And this entire system and the politicians that you mentioned, with the exception of like a couple like honest ones, every single politician is designed to uphold the system no matter what the cost is, even if they are interested in like slightly reforming it. There is no one out there, especially in America, who's like, we need to upend this system. We need to drastically change the status quo. We need to ensure that people can live a dignified existence beyond, like, imagine the world beyond capitalism. I forget who said this, but it's easier, I think, for you to imagine the end of the world and to imagine the end of capitalism. And that's a big problem for a lot of social democrats who also don't engage with theory.
Yeah, so look, I want to get to what you think your ideal is, because I know what my ideal is. It's to fix the system, et cetera. And so let me address what you're saying. Then I want to go to profit as a bridge to what your ideal is. So look, when you talk, I'm going to go back to the anecdote, but only as I hope it's illustrative, and that's why I'm going to it, right? So my dad wound up becoming affluent. That's true, but if you start the story there, it's misleading. So he, as you know, was totally broke, poor, nothing. Okay, started with absolutely nothing. Now, he had family support, right? So his uncle let him stay for free in a small apartment in Istanbul, and the government gave him a free education. Otherwise, he couldn't have done it. But basically, had no money whatsoever. So in a capitalist system where the government struck the right balance, he was able to then become a mechanical engineer, start his own company, hire 100 people, be successful, et cetera. I'd say that's a pretty good shining example of class mobility and capitalism working right. And then, yes, by the time that I start Young Turks, he has become affluent and he helps me to do it. And I want everybody to understand, you're absolutely right when you talk about luck, when you talk about, it doesn't mean it's all luck, and I don't want people to get discouraged by that at all. But at the same time, for people who are naive and think, oh, bootstraps, et cetera, there are the extraordinary stories like my dad. But for me, no, it's not extraordinary. If my dad didn't have capital to invest in this and in like keeping me propped up, et cetera, I never would have made it. It's not even close and it's not arguable. Even when I was in the crack hotel in Miami, and it was literally a converted crack hotel.
There were cockroaches everywhere. I'm not taking that away from you at all.
No, I know, but I'm saying, you're partly right about that. Even when I was in that, I knew that I had the safety net of, yeah, but if everything goes disastrously, I can still go to my dad's basement, right? And it's like Henry David Thoreau. Yeah, you're in the wilderness, dude, except it turns out it's your dad's backyard and he runs a pencil factory. So I get all that, but at the same time, that brings me to profit, right? So when people invest into a company, if you look at it just as the small window of, let's say your output, as you said in your example, is 30, whatever units, right? And we pay you 24, you think, well, you took the 6 from me. No, the 6 needs to go into air conditioning, which apparently there's not enough of in this studio.
Oh, lights, no. Rent, okay, that's a fundamental misunderstanding.
No, I'm with you. Even if the 24 is built into all the costs, okay, it still needs to go to profit because otherwise no one would ever invest. Right? So you need to have a return for the investment. Otherwise, you can never, literally never start any business. See, that's why I do believe in capitalism, because that return on investment drives the profit. The profit motive drives the return on investment, which drives capital creation and businesses that employ all of us.
We will get back to the fundamental disagreement that we have in regards to finance capitalism and how that has literally been the bane and the real reason why we have seen such a drastic erosion in a matter of 30 to 40 to 50 years. We can talk about that in a brief moment, but before we get there, something that I have to point out again is that you are using anecdotes when you talk about Dogen, when you talk about my grandfather or your father, and there's a problem with that, especially when this is still the same system that in the Gilded Age had drastic wealth inequality, right? Drastic wealth and income inequality, and we saw the consequences of that. And we have now, this is the same system again, that even through a series of reforms have gotten back to that same level of inequality. We have 2,048 billionaires on this planet right now. We know exactly who they are. We know how much money they have. They have enough money. Just their sheer wealth accumulation this past year alone could solve extreme poverty at the global level 7 times over. That distribution is built in to every facet of our lives. It gets legitimized through our institutions, and that is the main problem. And that's precisely why we have virtually no class consciousness in this country. And I'm saying that it's great. We have the same goals in the short term. I want to ensure that the material conditions of all Americans are improved drastically. It is an absolute necessity. But in the long run, this system needs to be completely revamped.
So
you can
I don't
call
agree
it
with that.
socialism. You can call it whatever you want, and that's why I
So
say
let's
this.
get into those details, Haas, because look, in terms of the anecdotes, et cetera, I don't want people to get it mistaken. We don't live in the society that my dad grew up in and had those opportunities.
But
in.
even in the society that Dogen grew up in, there were still plenty of people who were insanely poor and stayed that way. The overwhelming majority of poor.
Okay, I'm going to say something controversial, and people are going to hate me in a second. Okay, but first, look, in today's society, like Elizabeth Warren talks about this, she went to college for $50. Okay, no, ain't nobody going to college for $50. Well, then you just destroyed class mobility. The GI Bill of Rights and GI's education, basically free college education. That's why in the 1940s, 1950s, America was a much freer, much more democratic, and more capitalist society, not less capitalist society. Now there's a corporatist society that says, no, now you got to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars for any chance of mobility, which then makes you an indentured servant of corporations in order to pay that money back. I've talked to politicians on this show and even billionaires on this show who say, yeah, back then my dad was a jazz musician. Ray Dalio, the largest hedge fund owner in the world, said my dad was a jazz musician and we bought a house for $17,000 in Long Island. Now that is gone, obliterated. There's almost no class mobility left. So we must fundamentally change what we have today. But when you go back to my dad's era, a lot of people from his era and his town that were just as poor as him didn't make it out. And so I think it's totally okay for them not to make it out. They didn't figure out that you should go to college. Some of them worked hard, some of them didn't, some of them got lucky, some of them didn't get lucky, etc. But what do you want? Do you want a system that says, well, you didn't work hard as hard as my dad, but I'm gonna give it to you anyway? So like that, I don't mean to be, like, I don't want to set up a false thing for you. I want you to explain.
I'll explain it, because this is the constant misinformation that a lot of people spread about like communism or socialism. Well, not communism, but at least like socialism or leftist ideals, which is like, oh, you want equality of outcome. No, that's not true at all. No one is saying like we need to shave the bone density of like basketball players that have like a genetic advantage or something over others, or like make sure that they're operating at a handicap so that like everyone's playing and we have full equity or full equality. That's not a real thing, obviously. And also, like full equality, even equality as a concept is like always confusing, because if you consider like full equality, okay, well, what about equal representation? Like, do we just want, like a liberal will say, I want more female prison guards. And a leftist in this instance would say, well, why do we have prisons to begin with? Maybe let's analyze that. Maybe let's talk about prison abolition or reforming the criminal justice system from within.
See, that's a good example. Can I just jump in for 1 second? Because where I would come out on that is, I would say it's mental to think that you don't need prisons. Of course you need prisons. But with a giant but, you should teach all the guards the Stanford prison experiment so that they know that they will naturally be cruel to the detainees, whether it's justified or not, and have a tradition and a culture and training for the guards that they understand it. You shouldn't put people in prison based on cash bail, because that is based on class for no reason at all. You shouldn't put people in jail for smoking marijuana, etc. So there's massive reforms to be done to get our criminal justice reform to the place that it needs to be. But if you say there shouldn't be prisons, and I'm not saying you are saying that, for anyone who is, well, then I don't agree.
Okay. Yes, there will be back and forth whenever we discuss these sorts of concepts. That's totally understandable. The point I was trying to make is that equality is not always exactly as intended. And the reason why I'm mentioning this is because like there are differences between like what we can offer to every worker and how to do that. And the delivery mechanism for you is the state. And that's fine, and I understand that's a good concept. I somewhat agree with that. I'm not an anarchist. But my point is that there has never been a democratic process, and that in order to even achieve democracy, we need to have more political agency and more political autonomy. And the only way that we've like kind of arrived at that has been through like labor unions and the power of collective bargaining and all of that applied pressure that forced FDR and previous administrations to implement modest social reforms to correct the aberration, to correct all of the systemic inequalities. Well, not all of them, but some of them. But ultimately, we still operate under the assumption that this is totally fine and the best kind of organization that we can exist under, and that is why we still have, as you will also admit, politicians that are always going to represent the interests of corporations. It's not a new thing. It's not just because of Citizens United. The Citizens United decision is not the only reason why we have wealthy oligarchs paying politicians whatever they want to get whatever kind of legislation that they want. It predates 1978. It predates the New Deal. This has always been the case. And my point is that it's been the case because the system is designed to manufacture these results.
Yeah, no, I don't agree. So
explain to me this then. If it's not about if it's corporatism and not capitalism, then why did we have such a hard time coming to terms with the abolition of slavery? If it wasn't purely at the behest of capital that our political figures, why did they design this country, right? A country that you've called the best country on earth at many different points. Why did they design this country to have a non-direct, like non-representative democracy that only worked for white male landowners and owners of slaves?
Yeah, so there's a couple of different answers to that. First off, there's always, I agree with you on that, there's always some competing interests, let's put it that way, between the capital owners and the non-capital owners. Slavery is a very stark example of that. And so but you should know that there was actually very large corporations around back then. The founding fathers actually despised those corporations. It was partly out of a revolution, not just against the British monarchy, but against those companies like the East Indian Company that they did that. The Boston Tea Party was not against the government, was not against the monarchy. It was against the British Tea Company that they did that. So, and they warned us about the takeover of corporations. Now, nonetheless, they were very affected by the capital situation in terms of slavery, et cetera. And, but also you have to give it in its proper historical context. So like, for example, people say, well, Islam actually greatly improved the rights of women back then in that geographic area, and that is true. They had no rights and Islam gave them some rights. I would counter that God should know that they should have full rights, right? Yeah. And so he should have amended the Quran by now or actually done it right. But when you talk about a democracy, we're not talking about a supernatural creature. We're talking about a normal evolution. And the reason why I respect the founding fathers so much is that not only did they significantly increase the amount of participation in our government by taking it from just the lords and the royalty, et cetera, to propertied white males. That now seems anachronistic because it's anachronistic because we don't live in that time. But back then, that was a massive, massive world-changing earthquake. And the second earthquake is understated, and everybody gets it wrong. When they said you should amend this Constitution, what that did was it allowed for nonstop revolutions. Every amendment is a revolution so that you don't have to go to violence, you don't have to pick up muskets, et cetera. And so they anticipated, and they were right, that we would expand the circle of liberty, and guess what? We did, it did work. Because if capital was always the oppressor, well, then there would be no way out. Then we would have never ended slavery, and we would have never had the civil rights movement, we would have never had the suffragettes, we would have never had any of those things, and we did have all those things. Now, it is extraordinarily difficult, and we wish it wasn't. That's why we're trying to fix the system, and right now, it has become more difficult than it has ever been, in a sense, in American history.
But we're not in disagreement on this. My point is that it is ahistorical to look at this. I mean, you already admitted it. It's ahistorical to look at this and say like, oh, well, ultimately we will expand rights and then that's how we're supposed to do it and assume that like that's precisely how things would go. Obviously, every single instance of social progress and even economic progress, albeit that was less frequent, has been done through a lot of public pressure. And of course that it still happened. And I get that, and that's great. But it almost feels like you and I are in agreement that there is a next stage in this evolution. And my point has always been that that next stage in our evolution comes from increasing the democracy that we experience. And that actually brings us to, I guess, the second point that I wanted to get to in this conversation, which is, if you believe that democracy works in the level of governance, why don't you believe that we can implement democracy in the workplace, especially considering that adults spend 80% of their entire lives inside of these corporations, and these corporations are absolutely authoritarian in its structure. Yeah. There is a top-down power structure, and that contributes significantly to alienation. That is, again, a consequence of the class antagonism that I mentioned before, and the fact that wealth is concentrated at the top, and they are allowed to do this. But the worst part about this is that we take it for granted. We assume that this is the norm when it should not be the norm, and that's my point. And that's one way to transition into a true democracy where we are getting more democratic outcomes within the workplace through commodity production, and then ultimately through the drastic wealth redistribution that occurs as a consequence of that will help us gain, like us American workers, gain more dignity and more power and become better equipped to argue for their own interests.
Okay, so there's a lot of layers to that, and we'll get through them one by one. First of all, it depends on the type of company that you have. First layer is the size of the company. So if you have a very large company that is incredibly profitable, well, then you have less, let's put it this way, and it's a funny way of putting it, but less excuse not to share it with your employees, with the community, et cetera. You're just doing that to maximize profit. And they colloquially call it greedy, but I'm going to explain in a second that it's built into the coding, and so it's almost mandatory. If you're a smaller company, well, it's a matter of survival. So when we were talking the original example of the 24 and the 30 and all that, well, you're just trying to get to break even, and that's a completely different dynamic. Okay, but that's less important. The more important distinction is private companies versus public companies. So a private company run by a founder or a CEO, et cetera, can really do whatever it wants. And he could say to its investors, it could say to different things, hey, this is how much I'm gonna share with the employees, and it becomes more discretionary. Once you become a public company, you do not have a choice anymore. You must maximize profit at all costs. Otherwise, you will be removed from your position.
Yeah, your fiduciary responsibility, it's literally built in. It's almost like, once again, that like every facet of even our legal institutions are protecting the interests of, as you say, the donor class, or as I would say, capital owners.
So I think there's a huge difference between donor class and capital owners. But in this case, even within capital owners, the public corporations must be reformed. They're what led to corporatism. So if you set up the rules as we have them currently today in America, and you say you have no other concerns, no other stakeholders, you don't have to worry about your community, you don't have to worry about your workers, your only directive, and we built it into the law. We built it, because what is a company? A company is a legal fiction. It is something that we created as a state. In a democracy, at some point, we said there has to be this thing called a company so that it's limited liability and not everybody who works there is liable for what the company does. So that is necessary. But then when you turn them into public corporations and you write into the code, there's no other factors. You must make every single cent that you can. Well, then they're gonna crush everything in their path. And that's what leads to capture of the government. That's what leads to paying your workers as little as possible. They get them to the breaking point. And so that is exactly what you're combating and what I agree with you on, Haas, okay?
Well, private corporations, again, though, still have that same inappropriate power dynamic. And it's not like wealthy people are offering more wages or offering like more benefits to their employees out of the kindness of their heart.
Yeah, so let's do those two.
It can happen.
That's right. That's right.
But so that's not the norm. So obviously someone has to apply pressure to ensure that even private corporations does that. But unfortunately, it doesn't happen, and it hasn't happened. And my point there is that it hasn't happened because, again, the wealthy have built this system in every institution.
Okay, so there's 4 layers to that. Let's try to break it down. There's public corporations. We agree on public corporations. Yeah. They're fundamentally wrong in their infrastructure, in their setup, in their conception even, okay? So then there's private corporations, and you're right that there is a range there. So a person could be a good employer and share a lot with their employees. Actually, ironically, Howard Schultz, who's terrible on politics, is actually a pretty good boss and has shared a lot more with his employees than other corporations have chosen to do. And it's partly because he's a founder. Even if when they became a public corporation, he retained enough power to be able to be decent to not only his employees, but to the farmers that he works with in Latin America, et cetera. It's so ironic because he seems like such a jerk right now publicly. But anyway, in a private corporation, you do have a range. But once you have the range, you're right, there'll be plenty of people at the top who go, no, I'm not gonna share with my employees at all. I'm gonna maximize every penny because I want to, right?
None of the processes that you mentioned are actually democratic, and that's precisely what I'm saying.
That's right.
The workers are not making, the workers are not making democratic decisions in who they choose as their managers, or the workers are not making democratic decisions.
I got you. I'm getting to that. So,
okay.
So the first category, you can't have democracy in the workplace by definition. And the second category, you potentially could, but most don't. The third category is, I think, what you're advocating for, some sort of more. Well, let me put it this way. It exists in the world. Like in Germany, there are boards where there's a management board and a supervisory board. The supervisory board is made up, depending on the size of the company, of 1/3 labor or even half labor. If the company is larger, it can be 50% of the board is controlled by labor. So that's a situation that says it's no longer optional. We're now saying some degree of democracy is mandatory at work. And if you set it up right, and I think the Germans largely have, well, that could work really, really great. And that's how you change the rules to get to the outcomes that you want. I think the fourth layer is when you then have the employees completely run the company. And I think, we'll talk about it more, but I think I'm totally opposed to that.
I think you are totally opposed to that. Otherwise, we would be running a cooperative corporation right now. My point was my point was, and still is, that no matter how you cut it, like, we have completely accepted this reality that of course it's not going to be a democratic process in the corporations, inside of the workplace. And that is shocking to me. It's always been shocking to me, and it's still shocking to this day to me that no one's like, wait a minute, we want to have a democracy, like we're advocating for a democracy and governance, but for some reason we spend most of our lives in this place, and there is no democratic process where I don't get to figure out what I think is best for the company, or sit down with other people that even know better than me and like make the best possible choices, but have some sense of agency within my work that I'm creating. And that's obviously due to division of labor as well, but there are ways to mitigate that alienation, and we're not doing that. And one way of doing that is democratizing the workplace, which I think is a good first step towards higher levels of socialization, and then ultimately a drastic reorganization of our economy. We are going to go to a break.
Hold on, let me just say one thing before we go
2 minutes?
to that. Yes, before we go to that. Look, guys, so I believe in some form of democracy in the workplace, and it's a balancing act. So in America, we have B Corps and benefit corporations, and that's a slightly different balancing act, and one that's really worthy to look at. And so, and I think that between that and the German example, there are some things that where we can get to a better balancing act, way better balancing act than we have here. But I think our fundamental disagreement, which we'll talk more about in the next hour, is I think there are many situations, including work, where a democracy doesn't necessarily make sense. So it's an interesting rhetorical point, and even one that is beyond rhetorical. It's an interesting point, period, that we should discuss, and that's why we're doing this. But you can certainly concede that there are situations like team sports, the military, where a democracy doesn't work. Hey guys, are we gonna take the hill or are we not gonna take the hill? Well, let's have a vote. Okay, well, if you have a vote, nobody's gonna go take the hill, right? Let alone the fact that there'll be chaos. So it depends. Is a company more like the military or is a company more like the government?
Yes, commodity production is a little different. We will be talking about that in the next hour. If you want to see that, you have to unfortunately become a member. It is behind a paywall. It's for members only content. You can do that by going to tyt.com/agitprop. It's only $5 a month. And if you join through that process, then they'll know that this show should be kept alive.
Okay, can I say before we go, look, the reason we do it, guys, is one, we got to get to break even. Okay, we're not McDonald's or Johnson & Johnson and sitting in profits, etc. We actually have to keep the lights on. And if you could see the air conditioning in this room, you'd know barely keeping it on. Okay.
Cenk is going to explain to me why democracy doesn't work in the second hour, so we're very excited about that
But in
process.
a sense though, this, you guys deciding to join or not join is a form of democracy. Hey, I like that show. I'm gonna join based on that show.
Okay.
You should keep that show on the air.
All right, stop trying to
Democracy.
shill, all right? We'll be back. We'll be back in like 2 minutes, all right? Bye. All right, we're back. For the members only, we're going mask off, ladies and gentlemen. Now we're gonna talk about some the nitty gritty and why Cenk hates democracy, apparently, as he said. So let's just get started immediately. I hope you guys enjoy this, by the way. So if you do, write to Cenk and everyone else, and I hope you guys are becoming members just to see this. But yeah, let's get started. So you mentioned the military and you mentioned teams, and you said, well, you know, no one's gonna rush the hill. Obviously, commodity production is a little bit different than imperialism, even though imperialism is the final stage of capitalism, and it's basically a necessity for capitalism to continue as it has historically with the East Indian Company that you mentioned, and all of the awful things that Western developed nations have done. More powerful nations have done to less powerful nations, and it continues to this day, which we will be touching on. That was going to be my second point, but let's just go directly into the democracy in the workplace argument. Why don't you think it works?
So look, I'll start with the obnoxious example and then work my way. I went to Occupy Wall Street. There's a lot that I loved about it. I started Wolfpack at Occupy Wall Street, but I also saw them ordering a pizza and taking 45 minutes to do it, right? With the this and the this and the this. You need a leader to just step up, go, okay, raise your hands. How many want pepperoni? How many want vegan? And then we're done with it, okay?
Right. Okay, explain to me why that cannot be selected democratically.
Yeah, so they can, and I guess they were closer to anarchy than they were to democracy.
That happens.
So that's a fair point. But I'm worried that in a workplace that hard decisions will be near impossible to make if your employee run. Okay.
Would you say?
So
would you say a hard decision, for example, is the hard decision that capital owners made when they decided to export their manufacturing jobs over to the third world because they knew that there could be a race to the bottom for labor prices, and it would ultimately increase their profits at the cost of destroying the American working class, for example?
Yeah, well, partly. So, so number one, it doesn't have to be that way, and that's why I believe in reforming the system. So the Germans did not outsource most of their jobs, partly because they have labor on their boards. And the labor wants the company to succeed because they don't want to lose their jobs, but they also have an enormous incentive, obviously, to keep the jobs in Germany, right? So there is a better way of striking that balance. Now, having said that, there are plenty of companies here in America that if you made them keep their jobs in America, would go out of business. So that would have been a wrong decision. And so now the workers, of course, want to keep their jobs in America. They don't live in Vietnam, so they would all vote to keep them here. And as it turns out, maybe you could have saved half their jobs if we exported the jobs to Vietnam. And so I'm kind of an interesting progressive because I'm an internationalist. So
I am too, but very different in very different ways than you are, I think.
Right. I think the life experience, I can show you chart after chart of how wonderful the rise of China and Vietnam has been. So now not a lot of progressives go in that direction, and certainly the right wing now is furious at that, etc. But I'm a humanist and I'm proud of it. In fact, here, let me show you just a couple here. Let's go to graphic 3. This is China's poverty rate from 1970 to 2017, okay? So I look at that chart and some people might look at it and go, those jobs should have stayed here, et cetera, et cetera. I love that chart. I love that China's gotten so much better. There's 1.2 billion people that have a lot less poverty than they used to. And by the way, what started in 1978? Deng and his drive towards, in reality, a free market, not a free market, but a much more capitalist system. So that's a win for capitalism, and it's a win for the world.
So interesting that you say that, considering again that this is a fundamental difference that you and I have, where you consider, when you look at it from an American perspective, you consider what happened in China exploitative, right? Like the fact that we are taking advantage of these group of individuals, the lack of regulation in this country, and basically making them work for essentially slave wages, right? And that's still, those material conditions have improved a little bit, but it's terrible.
No, they've improved a lot.
Okay, they've improved a lot, but it's still terrible, obviously.
I know, so this is a natural cycle.
So, okay, I know, but my point is, how is this any different in many ways, especially considering the Chinese labor force didn't democratically say, oh yeah, no, come and please exploit us, and that this was essentially an authoritarian construct, a decision made by Chinese leadership to exploit their own people, then how is this any different in many ways to, for example, a counter argument like, well, African Americans' living conditions in America are much better than Africans living in Africa, and that's a consequence of them being forcefully brought into America through the slave trade. Obviously, it's not great.
No, that's so. I understand where you're going with that analogy, but you know that that's enormously inexact, right?
Well, how much structural violence is acceptable as long as there are marginal improvements in the material conditions of the society that you're exploiting is basically the question that I have.
So, Hans, there's two differences there, in my opinion. One is, what is the ideal and what I would want, right? So I wouldn't want the guys who make the phones in China to sell barbed wires, fencing, so they can't leave, and to work 12 hours or 15 hours or 18 hours a day. I would want, and I would try to implement far more reasonable working conditions. But naturally, it doesn't occur that way because capital goes to where it's going to be cheapest. So naturally, it does start in very bad situations, very exploitive, et cetera. Not slavery, because slavery nobody was compensated. That was just slavery, right? So here they are at least compensated. And as you see with that chart, and I have more and more of those, they actually do eventually improve their living standards. In fact, China has improved their living standards so much that now a lot of the companies are going to Vietnam and Southeast Asia. And what that does is it's now raising the living standards of Vietnam. So as ugly as that process is, it has actually lifted a huge portion of the earth to much higher living standards.
I know, but what you're once again missing is that the collective wealth that the 1% is generating as a consequence of this is 85% of overall wealth accumulated, whereas the rest of the world is only getting 15%. And that dynamic is completely inappropriate, and it's a consequence of capitalism. Exploitation that occurs in the workplace can absolutely be expanded on when you consider faceless multinationals taking advantage and using the state to take advantage of through trade agreements and multinational trade agreements.
So we're in the
middle
of
take advantage of an exploited working class in developing nations.
So you're right, but we're in the middle of that natural evolution right now. So how did it happen in America? We had the same kind of exploitation in America. We had the robber barons, we had the Pinkertons that would break the strikes, and they would and they'd break people's legs, and sometimes kill them, et cetera, right? So that was pretty damn ugly, right? So then the people rose up, and that led to Teddy Roosevelt, and then Franklin Roosevelt, and the power of people in a democracy when we actually had a relatively real democracy. And so then the government counterbalanced the interest of the moneyed class and the robber barons, and eventually swung the pendulum in the direction of the workers. Social Security, Medicare, taxes at 90% for the highest marginal tax rate, a much larger estate tax, because all that creates equality of opportunity, because then you could build highways and you could have more free education, et cetera, et cetera. So that's happening now in the rest of the world. So right now, as we speak today on the Young Turks, we're gonna do a story about how they're rising up in Hong Kong. It's kind of a curious example because Hong Kong's already wealthy, right?
Yeah.
But people do rise up, and they're rising up in America now, the teacher strikes. So we're back to a point where we are so out of equilibrium that people rise up, and then you get to a slightly better situation. And that rise to a better living standards is oftentimes brutal and ugly and unfortunate.
Yeah.
And it's not the ideal.
I would say the USSR would, in your literally in your example.
But when you try to force a different way of doing it, it just doesn't work.
Well then,
but help me understand. Well, how would you do it? Because I am actually open to it. That would make it better.
I will. The point I was going to make is, look, the inherent irony, and this is a Slavoj Žižek opinion. The inherent irony of talking about these nations like China or even the USSR is that they are very good at capitalism. They are better at capitalism right now than America is, technically.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. And that's not the future I want for myself. I don't think that's the future you want for America.
No, but remember,
either.
they're in the robber baron era.
Okay,
so they're in America.
But my
in
point
like
is, if we're talking about GDP or if we're talking about like improving the living conditions, then these other nations that I would consider authoritarian and terrible are great. The USSR is just did incredible things then through the process of collectivization. In a matter of a couple decades, they went from an agriculture, like agrarian society of potato farmers to beating the US in the space race. Same with Mao's China, like literacy rate, not Mao's China, but like literacy rates increasing, public health opportunities, like food programs. Like this is. So that's not the metric of success though, but for some weird reason, it is the metric of success when we look at it from a capitalist framework where through all of this brutality, we say, well, hey, you know what? Even though like global affluence has increased dramatically and technological advancements play a gigantic factor in that, we're just going to say, capitalism is responsible for the uplifting of the global poor, and that's why this kind of exploitation everyone in any other circumstance, when we're looking at it, would say this is awful, as you admitted as well, is acceptable. Why is it acceptable?
Haas, I think it's way too simplistic, and I don't want people to think I'm saying this. It's way too simplistic to say it was just capitalism that rose up our living standards across the world. Of course, there was the scientific advancements that we had. It was an enormous part of it. Now you could argue that capitalism helped those scientific advancements go further, et cetera. But so it's a combination of those factors. But I think capitalism was a very, very large factor in that.
I think capitalism is just the reorganization of the economy. Like,
but look at what a difference it makes. So there's some absolutists on the right wing in this country that I obviously disagree with, and they say, oh, you can't get anything done in these communist systems. Well, that's not true, as you point out. Russia, Soviet Union went to space. China could literally move mountains overnight because they just order it and then it gets done, right? And Cuba does have a good healthcare system and a relatively decent education system. But you also can't be an absolutist on the other side. And yes, they did do those things, but China was an absolute disaster otherwise.
I agree.
Until they went to capitalism.
No, by the way, no, China was not an absolute disaster in comparison to the previous living conditions and how much their society progressed.
That's a great point.
And same with the USSR, and same with when we talk about capitalism, which I agree with. Capitalism was a better way of producing commodities in the previous economic organization, which I would consider like serfdom, right? Feudalism. So I don't disagree with that at all. What I'm simply saying is the way that commodity production works now, with automation, with as you know, McKinsey and all these other like big four consultancy firms call Industry 4.0, I think, is that what they're calling it now? Like Smart Industry 4.0, whatever. They're just like with artificial intelligence and automation, we have definitely already gotten to the point of capitalism where commodity production can be virtually automated with like very little work. And if we look at the problems in the US, for example, as far as, and this is the second graph that I want to put up, productivity versus the average real earnings of the American, productivity has gone up. It is skyrocketed.
Oh, that's my favorite chart of all time.
Whereas obviously the real wages of goods producing workers have remained absolutely.
Look at where the break is.
Yeah.
1978.
Absolutely stagnant. So the point, hold on. So the point I'm trying to make is this, and this occurs everywhere. This is a very Marxian framework. The way looking at this and saying major sector, like productivity goes up, but wages remain stagnant.
No, that chart right there, Haas, is not Marxian. That is Jenkian. Okay. Because look at the argument I made earlier. From 1944 to 1978, productivity and wages go up at the same rate when you actually have much closer to real capitalism and real democracy. You lose democracy in 78, not through Citizens United, but through Buckley v. Vallejo and Bellotti.
Yeah.
Once you lose democracy, gone. Then the rich take everything.
The point is that even then we didn't have democracy, but because of the labor militancy and like actual like workers rising up and trying to fight back for their, trying to fight back to regain some sense of autonomy or some sense of agency, we were able to get to a productivity and wages matching up. If you look at that data across time, it obviously changes. But again, the reason why I'm mentioning this is because like this is occurring all around the world, okay? This is happening everywhere, and the politicians that we have.
I actually don't think so, Haas. So let me show you other charts. So, okay, so let's go to Vietnam life expectancy, for example. You'll see that there is not a sharp drop off. There's only an increase. This is graphic 5 for me, okay? So you see during the war, obviously it's an absolute disaster. After the war, there's stability. And then once they start going towards capitalism, takes off, okay? Now, so it always goes back to, I know it's slightly annoying, but it's so true of life. It depends. It depends on how you're applying it, what all the things are. And you make a really good point that 1944 to 78 isn't just as I describe it. There was enormous labor pressure, which helped to get us to a situation where your wages actually match your productivity in America.
And it always historically has eroded, and that's precisely my point. And the reason why it keeps eroding is because the way that we accumulate capital is absolutely normalized, and there is no other way of looking at this. And I don't.
So Haas, I really gotta ask you this because because again, I'm genuinely curious.
Yeah.
So you make another terrific point that almost nobody makes, which is that, and I know some do, but not in the mainstream press certainly, or in mainstream political dialogue, which is okay. So the Soviet Union was a disaster, but what was before it was a bigger disaster, right? Everybody leaves that out.
And also the collectivization efforts in the Soviet Union. And I am no tanky, I'm not a defender of the Soviet Union. I just want to put that out there. I think we need to learn from our mistakes in the past and like socialization efforts that absolutely failed, and I would consider the USSR to be one of those.
Of course.
Like obviously, it's just so I put that out there. But what we fail to consider is like the 400 years of collectivization efforts in the West that accompanied human slavery, that accompanied colonialism, that accompanied all of the exploitation that occurred, the enclosure of public space, the common goods and public spaces. Like none of this is ever mentioned when we talk about how the West became industrialized. But when we look at the USSR, it happened through such a short period of time, and of course it was brutal. And that's understandable that there was going to be brutality, and I would have liked to have seen less of that, of course, but
or none. But I would like to see less of the brutality of capitalism.
Yeah.
So it's fair. But what I wanted to get to is, as much as it, in some ways, but definitely not in other ways, improved the feudal system that Russia had before the Soviet Union. But at the end of the day, in the time that the Soviet Union was alive, it did significantly worse than the Western capitalism in terms of all the normal metrics.
Well, you have to look at the starting point and the material conditions, of course. You can't
but
just like,
okay, let's take East Germany and West Germany because their starting conditions were incredibly similar. They were both devastated. Now, granted, America put a lot of money into West Germany, but but the Soviet Union put a considerable amount of money into East Germany, right?
Okay.
Not as much as America did into West Germany.
But ultimately, their starting point is different.
Do you agree that the Soviet Union did materially worse than the West? And if Like, or do you think, and obviously this is also warped by the fact that it wasn't really communism or socialism, it was authoritarianism.
Exactly.
But having said that, they did do some significant chunk of communism where they assigned people to work, they
centralized. It was a central planned economy that sought to improve the living conditions of the people rather than, like, it's supposed to be. It's supposed to honor the understanding of a dictatorship of the proletariat rather than a dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, which is.
And I look at it and I say it didn't work.
Yeah, okay, I understand that, and there are many different reasons why it failed, and we don't need to go over all of them or that at all. Considering
so then let's
that
go to the core. Let's go to the core.
I don't even agree with it. My point is, and it's like I'm not a vanguard. I'm not a vanguardist. I'm not a Marxist-Leninist. I believe in reform. So I believe that the pathway towards socialization moves through a social democracy. And that's why I think that a coalition between social democrats all the way to Marxist-Leninists is an absolute necessity in the short term, and then we can discuss the differences in opinion in the long term. But
do you agree that central planning doesn't work?
No, I don't. I don't agree. I think that central planning can work. Central planning already works all the time. And we completely take it for granted. When we think about the authoritarian way that Amazon develops commodities and creates commodities, or Walmart, for example, creates commodities, that is central planning in action. The point is,
that's actually ironically my point.
The point is we need to redistribute the power and wealth in that centralized, in central planning in that regard.
See, I'm looking for a balance. So does some central planning work? Absolutely, right? So China can reduce the level of carbon in the air and pollution, not overnight, but close to overnight, because they have central planning. They just simply order it. Whereas here you have to go through the court system, there's a lot of competing interests, and it takes much, much longer because we're in a democracy. So central planning is better at some things. And inside a company, central planning is, in my opinion, definitely better than a democratic system where you poll the workers, okay? Now, having said that, central planning fails terribly in other respects because it takes away the liberty to choose the profession that you want. It takes away the drive to create more profit and capital, et cetera. It takes away the normal human incentives and disincentives. So I'll put out a marker now, which is kind of a fun one. We'll get to look back at 20, 30 years from now. Everyone thinks China is going to be #1 economy in the world. Nobody's thinking about India. I think in the long run, India will beat China. The reason is they have unbelievable action in India, and it's chaotic. It's nearly anarchy. There's out of control capitalist greed there, and the top certainly taking most of the money, et cetera, et cetera. China has this machine they've built through central planning, but at the end, capitalism beats central planning. India will beat China because it'll create many more ideas.
Has central planning. It's not the same level of central planning. I mean, look at the amount of subsidies we offer to the fossil fuel industry in comparison to renewable energy, right? There are way more job openings in the green energy sector at the moment, but what fossil fuel industry gets 85% of the subsidies.
Yeah, that's government capture.
So, but the point, it's rent-seeking behavior, and I completely understand that. But the point is, when they have more money, and they will always have more money, and the entire construct is authoritarian to begin with, and they only care about their profits, it almost seems like that, and we continue to justify this accumulation of power and wealth and capital at the top. This is going to continue working the way it does.
So let me go practical again. So I think that everything that I propose as a reform, you also agree with, but would like to do more, right?
Yes, I believe in a post-capitalist. So I believe in a post-capitalist society. So the pathway towards that goes through social democracy, right? It absolutely goes through improving the material conditions of the American working class, healthcare, free education, and better collective bargaining power for the American labor unions, like create labor unions, force to create labor unions. And then the next step in that process is also democratizing the workplace, creating public banks, setting up like they did in Sweden, what is it called, whatever.
I forgot that too.
It's a wage fund for laborers. It's like a labor wage funds that help and drastically change the way that the way that capital moves around at the behest of cooperatives rather than private ownership, or rather than ownership at the top in the way that the authoritarian way of running companies, so that we have more cooperatives. And we know statistically that cooperatives operate at the same level of productivity, if not more productive. There are great examples of cooperatives under a capitalist organization like Mondragon in Spain, or the third, number 3 in New Zealand is also a cooperative. There's like sneaky cooperatives all around us. No, but like seriously, people are not aware of it.
I'm amused that you call it sneaky, but I agree with you.
Yeah, no, people are just not aware of that reality. So
let's talk about those cooperatives.
But hold on, let me just finish really quickly. And then through that process, you activate every worker, and you help them engage in the political process in a meaningful fashion. And what it does, because trade unions aren't just about collective bargaining. Of course, that's the main point, and that's a necessity, obviously, because of that power imbalance that we both agree to at this point. But they also provide educational opportunity. They teach about the capitalist dynamic, the things that I'm telling you, the things that I want to talk about on this show. Trade unions have provided and offered, and that was incredibly important in building class consciousness. So this way, workers can actually create better tools for themselves to advocate for their best interests, and to finally get to a real democratic process where they can say, this is the kind of representation that we want. So democracy and governance has to start at democracy in the workplace, where we spend most of our lives. And then at the final stage, I believe in the nationalization of immediately nationalizing the extraction industry and anything that touches the commons, and moving away from our over-reliance on fossil fuel production, and ultimately move to the Green New Deal and renewable energy as quickly as possible. And some of that is going to be somewhat authoritarian. Well, sucks to suck. It won't change your life that drastically.
Right. So it's all a matter of where you draw the lines, and I'm actually surprised that we're again closer than I imagined. So, for example, when you started listing the more that you would do, public banks, I agree. I think, and I got convinced of that through this show. I would have guests on, and initially I was a little skeptical. How would a public bank work? I looked into it, and they explained it, and I realized, no, not only can it work, it already does work. North Dakota has a public bank, and it works perfectly fine.
Better than private banks.
In fact, even nationalizing the extraction industries, whether it's fossil fuel or other things that the people actually own, well, that's a super interesting argument, because partly and there's 2 different ways to draw that line. Well, one, the most socialist act maybe of my lifetime in America was done by Sarah Palin. So Sarah Palin in Alaska,
UBI.
Yeah, said, hey, look, that's our oil in Alaska. What I'm gonna do is, you're still gonna make a profit, but I'm gonna tax you way more than you've been taxed before. So that is a way of me getting the natural resources to the people of Alaska. That's why she had an 80% popularity rating, not because she was conservative, but because that one act was massively progressive, right? Yeah. And so that's one way of doing it. Another way of doing it is what Venezuela did. Now, you don't want to use Venezuela as an example of anything that's positive, but you can use Venezuela
as an example of tremendously positive policies under Chavez, and I think that Venezuela was a great, Venezuela was a good starting point for socialization. They did exactly what I'm talking about. Their literacy rate skyrocketed. They were able to offer public health services to like rural areas. Their poverty rate was decreasing. It was tremendous. Their over-reliance on their extraction industry, of course, was an issue, and they were trying to diversify their agricultural production and their economy in general. But what happened? What happened in Norway when they nationalized their oil extraction industry did not happen in Venezuela. What happened? Capital flight and American sanctions, and that because we relied on their oil, and we wanted to maintain, we wanted to take advantage and increase our profits of their natural resources. So we did everything we can, not boots on the ground imperialism, even though that did happen. We facilitated a coup d'etat and are still supporting
one under Chavez and one under Maduro,
and still are with like Guaido, and that failed, whatever. But but my point is, without any sort of without these sorts of externalities or without these sorts of outside pressure from Western imperialism, Venezuela, I think, could have been a very successful.
I don't, but I'll tell you, Venezuela is a great example of where to draw the lines, and maybe some of our disagreements about where to draw lines. Because I don't think nationalizing the oil was remotely the problem. That's what actually created a lot of wealth for the people of Venezuela. The problem was the authoritarianism, and it got worse and worse under Chavez, leading into Maduro, and then it goes terrible under Maduro. And they was too much central planning. And so if you had drawn the line, now it's easy for me to say now, but you're right, by the way, also that I should just say before finishing up Venezuela that American sanctions hurt a lot. And part of the reason that we did that was because we're
capital flight.
But we're captured by our corporations. So ExxonMobil's of the world wanted to teach a lesson to all the countries. Hey, if you actually make money from your own oil, America will punish you.
Well, so they did that to Iran as well.
Yeah, no question, no question.
So it almost seems like when brown nations that are easier to manipulate and exploit decide to democratically socialize, they get outside pressure that in 100%. Some instances literally stop them. And that is like the most authoritarian thing that you can do. And obviously to fight back against all of that, you have to become more authoritarian to have a better control. I don't excuse it. I don't like Maduro. I don't think he's done a great job, obviously. And his currency mismanagement only occurred as a currency mismanagement like in Argentina as well, because they are not America and they don't have the power to to do quantitative easing for 50 years in a row. We are literally in control of the entire world and the entire monetary transactions all around the world. So we can do whatever we want with our money and bail out the banks. And you and I agree on that stuff already. But the thing I'm trying to mention here is that, like, Venezuela could have been a beautiful project, and it was regarded as a beautiful project early on with Chavez. It genuinely improved the living conditions and material conditions of the Venezuelan working class, and that's why Chavez is still, after death, an incredibly popular figure in the country, right?
Yeah, and same in Brazil, and then of course the capital interest imprisoned the guy who was actually democratic, etc.
Exactly.
But there is a way to draw the line where you don't go to central planning and you don't go to authoritarianism, but you do in a sense, nationalize the things that make sense.
Can you tell me why you think Venezuela is authoritarian? Not from like social liberties, because I think like you don't have like the full free speech stuff that you have in America. You don't have all that liberalism, but no. As far as the economy goes, could you please describe to me why you think the Venezuelan economy is like more authoritarian than Norway, for example?
Yeah, Norway, as Trump would say. Look, now you get into a level of detail that I'm not sure that.
Well, I can tell you, it's because it's misinformation. The Venezuelan economy in 2014 was 70% private. The problem in the Venezuelan economy has always been the same exact problem that we have in the US economy, where the billionaire like agricultural producers, the food producers hated Maduro, hated Chavez. The wealthy landowners hated the socialization that was occurring there, and they fought back against it. And guess what? There was a larger nation willing and able to help out. And that's precisely what happened in Venezuela. And it could potentially happen in the US as well. And it is kind of happening in the US as well, maybe not on like such violent terms.
But with Maduro and Putin and Erdogan, etc., you're certain not only industries are favored, but certain companies within those industries
they have their own set of oligarchs.
So those oligarchs, in essence, become central planning,
as opposed to, or do you
and
mean
it's not
as opposed
really
to the
capitalism.
US?
Well, in America we have corporatism, and hence our oligarchs run corporations.
Okay, but so it almost seems like private capital has the power to corrupt. And if we had the opportunity to run these companies in a more democratic process.
So let's. I'm trying to get to that point.
Okay.
So there's so much that we agree on. I agree on the public banks, et cetera, et cetera. So when you get to democratizing the workforce, I need to understand more what that means. So if you say to me, okay, the workers are going to get to. So let's take the digital media companies. They're all in trouble, right? And so. They're not making enough revenue. They're not making any profit, and so then they have to cut their workforce, and that's real. That's a reality.
Because you accumulate, because you got private capital. Like, think about this company, and this is behind a paywall, so we can talk about this, right?
We know about anything.
Okay.
But
all right. But think about this company, okay? When we were 26 employees, I was the 26th employee of this company. We had more means. We had more means of production in our hands, and more say in the decision-making process, from all the way to the PA. To someone like yourself.
Supernatural.
Yeah.
It makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
Because as you grow, it becomes harder to manage, and you need people to manage.
But at some point in that growth process, we became more of a corporation. And that's where all of the problems started.
And there's nothing wrong with that.
No, well, obviously there was something wrong with that, because we had to downsize in the aftermath of it.
Right.
And that happened because we grew too fast. We brought in outside people who wanted to run it as a corporation, and then our burn rate was too high, I'm assuming. I don't know all the details, you can tell me. And if you don't want to talk about this, that's also
it's okay.
fine.
We could talk about it both in a general sense, we could talk about it in the context of a different company, etc. But even in the context of this company, when you're running a mom and pop shop, which we ran for a long, long time. Yeah, look, we always struggled to get to break even to begin with, right? So it's not like there was the good old days in that sense. And then secondly, yeah, of course it's easier to manage when it was after the show. It was me, Dave, Jill Pike, JR, and Jesus sitting around going, okay, what do you guys want to do? How do you want to do marketing? And we didn't have any resources, etc.
Exactly.
Okay, now when you have 150 people sitting around, we never got up to 150, but let's say 100, right? We were past 100 at one point, right? Well, then you can't sit around and make decisions like that, because it just doesn't work.
You still have the
unbelievably inefficient.
You still have the specialists, of course, and there is always, like right now, obviously, the government doesn't ask us when they want to, I don't know, do certain things like, well, what level of water pollution is acceptable for you guys? No, the government goes to the FDA or the EPA, and there's a rigorous process. There's an academic process where they figure out exactly what the levels are going to be, and they take into the consideration the needs of the people, and that's how they decide. So that's how it would happen in a company like this as well, obviously.
Okay, so let's take the example of downsizing, which almost every digital media company did. So let's say Vice has to downsize, right? They go to the employees, and what do they vote on? Whose job they're going to eliminate?
But you're failing to acknowledge that.
Or they don't want to eliminate anything and they go bankrupt.
No, downsizing literally occurred in that company. Downsizing rarely ever occurs in cooperatives, and their growth rate is, well, not for commodity production, but their growth rate in like the new people that they're bringing on is a little bit slower because of that. But that's why they have longer lifespans than normal, regular private capitalist corporations, because there is no like. The reason why Mondragon is number 3 in Spain right now is because during the global financial meltdown, they were able to move their resources around. They were able to move commodity production around. They were able to change and adapt. They were like water in the sense, in like the Bruce Lee sense of the word. They weren't static, and everyone was a part of the decision-making process, so they had less alienation, and they understood their role in the corporation. And that's what I seek to. That's what I seek to do with like my editors. When I started originally, when I started doing the breakdown, like there was so much autonomy and so much control over the editing process, and I knew that, and I worked with the producers as well, or the PAs, to find like different shots and set up different things, and that was because that gives everyone a piece of the puzzle. That gives everyone like some more power than just simply being a cog in the machine where you're just doing the daily monotonous tasks over and over again that someone told you.
Right.
And that's incredibly important in feeling like you're a part of the creation here.
So that's why we share the data here with our producers and our hosts. So we say, okay, here's your views, here's your revenue, here's what's happening. So you can see we're not making it up. You got to get to this, otherwise it's not sustainable, etc. So I don't know how much more we could do other than that. But when you look at so for example, I loved Pop Trigger. I love the people who worked on Pop Trigger. But it turns out in digital media, a successful entertainment show is not good enough. it has to be massively successful. If it doesn't get to mass scale on a tiny budget, it can't work. And you've seen the numbers of the revenue you get for the number of views that you get. It's a very, very hard to make it sustainable. So let's say we had a democratically run, quote unquote, democratically run company, okay? Or let's just use Vice as an example.
You're only talking about it in the times of downsizing without understanding that downsizing is not supposed to even occur.
Nonsense.
In the sense
Total
that,
nonsense.
Hold on, as I mentioned to you before, like Mondragon lost 0 employees when everyone was like going bankrupt. It's not an accident. It was on purpose.
Tell me the process. So
the process is like, even the process makes it so that there isn't a massive burn rate and there isn't like exponential explosive growth in the amount of people that you're bringing on, and we make better, more careful decisions, which doesn't change the commodity production or doesn't change the output that drastically, and ultimately leads to a healthier organization where people are.
Yeah, I don't believe it at all. So let me explain. Okay, so it's because I've actually run a company. And so, but by the way, I'm willing to like study that example more and more because I don't dismiss, I don't want to seem like I'm dismissing it out of hand because I really am not. I'm super curious if it's true that they didn't lose money when others were, how they made that happen. But in our case, so starting Pop Trigger made perfect sense. And we didn't start Pop Trigger after we had gotten an investment. We had it started way earlier than that, right? And so it made sense that talk shows online would work, and especially ones that directly and better connected with people, et cetera. So we started a number of those on tech, gaming, entertainment, et cetera.
You wanna know how you would change that drastically? As someone who literally worked on Pop Trigger, I can tell you, what did I do when I was at Pop Trigger? I worked my way up while I was doing the other stuff that I was working at TYT, and I also created Pop Crunch, which was a show that was much cheaper to produce than Pop Trigger.
Which would then, that's true, but if that worked, and that's a perfectly fine thing to suggest.
No, I stopped it because I did Facebook.
No, that's fine. But if that worked, you'd only need 1 host, and you would have to fire 3 hosts, a couple of producers. So there's no way around it.
No,
because some things work and some things don't work. There's no way around that.
I totally understand, but there's always some use that a person can have in a company. It doesn't mean that you can't fire people. I'm not even entirely sure on how the firing process works in cooperative corporations, or like what kind of pension you get or anything like that. And I really need to look into that a little bit further. My point simply is, like, there's still a decision-making body, right? But we elect people to that decision-making body to ensure that that decision-making body is making the best possible decisions while keeping us in mind. It's virtually the same as the German example that you always hold so highly in regard, but a little bit, it takes it one step further than that.
It does, I get it. So, but then wouldn't you run into the problem that you started the show with, which is you said the workers would want to work the least amount possible for the most amount of pay. Well, if you have that kind of dynamic, you're not going to have a very healthy company.
Well, democracy is about a balance, isn't it? Obviously.
But that's not a good balance.
Wait, no, that's not a good balance that benefits your interests. That is still a better balance that creates longevity for the company, that improves the material conditions of the workers, and if bared out to the entire way that our economy is run. And I don't even think this is the final stage. Like, I'm not an anarcho-syndicalist or anything like Richard Wolff. But in a transitional period, I think it's really beneficial to give more, like I said, autonomy and political agency to the workers. Help them understand that their actions have consequences.
See, that's where I think we are drawing the line. I think we are giving as much autonomy as possible. We're sharing information to the point where we bore the hell out of you guys in company-wide meetings by oversharing the information that we have.
Well, what you're also mistaken and what you're also forgetting is, like, there are plenty of restrictions in, for example, the way that agitprop is produced, right? Like, I originally came to the, I guess, negotiating table, and I have a tremendous amount of bargaining power that other people don't have, because I could just leave and literally do my own thing, and I would probably make more money, as I told you before. So So that's unique in that sense, and that normally isn't the case. And even then, what I wanted to do with Agitprop was try to experiment, and this didn't even get to you probably, or when I was talking to Judith, try to experiment in a cooperative model. Have every single person play a significant role and
but what if, okay, so let's take that example, although we're now in dangerous territory, but so let's talk about, okay, so let's say you guys decided to vote to give you guys more editors. Well, that's not fair to the other shows. Okay, so how does that work?
Wait, right? You democratically decide to give me more editors? No.
Like whatever the resources that you need, I just pick editors out of a hat.
It
right?
doesn't work that way. I can't just like ask you for additional resources.
So how does it work? I don't get it.
Yeah, no, it's more so about like even when we were building the set design, like I asked Edwin and Jesus, like, look. You guys are the pros,
and
you figure out exactly how you want to do this. Even when we're doing like the.
But Haas, you get that there are limitations, right? Because if this show costs X amount of money, we can't have it on the air. So like the Dan Rather show, people so it's a super interesting example. We ran 6 months with Dan Rather, and it was very successful. Got millions of views, and not enough revenue. And then it took up too much. If they had a democracy over at TYT Investigates that was running Dan Rather's show, they would vote to keep it on. And they'd be like, what are you, nuts? There's millions of views, it's incredibly popular, right? But not enough revenue, so there's just no way, no physical way that you could do it. I just don't see how the democracy helps.
So here's how it helps.
I mean, democracy.
Or here's how it doesn't work in the sense like directly in my experience, for example, with the breakdown. Yes, you are sharing all this data, and yes, you're like trying to incentivize by doing numerous different ways of like profit sharing or whatever. But ultimately, there's still an analytics team where like they're telling me they're trying to nudge me in a direction, in a particular direction that will lead to higher revenue. They want to generate more revenue ultimately, and like
but higher views, which gets you more exposure. So like if Agitprop's a great show, and the data team says, hey, if you do X instead of Y, more people will view it. Yes, we'll make more revenue so that it could get to break even, but also more people will view it.
I know.
So that isn't that cooperative? Isn't that what you want?
It just depends on what the goals are. The goals are under like as a worker here. My goal is to have as little alienation as possible, and as much control from my output, my product as possible. And when you have managers and when you have other people that are getting in line with that, I mean, getting ahead of that, they're like, no, you can't do this, even if you think it's a good idea. One, because it's like impossible to put together because it's going to take too many resources in the short term.
But don't you
maybe
need that?
In the long term? But like, if that's how we worked, we would have never had the breakdown. That's the point I'm trying to make.
But we also would have never had Pop Trigger. So some things work and some things don't, and you need managers to make those decisions.
No, it's not just managers that make the decisions, but and of course there's going to be still like executives that are like, well, this is a hard choice that we need to make. And like I said, I don't know exactly how the firing process works, but I would assume it's also democratic. But as I was saying, like without that level, I was able to create the breakdown because I didn't have that level of control, and I was aware of the resources that were available to me. I knew the lack of resources, and I worked through it. And while I was working through it, I literally gave as much autonomy as possible to the editors, as much autonomy as possible to the producers, and we worked through it together. And that's precisely why we were able to create a very successful operation that was generating a tremendous amount of revenue at some point, and even before that.
But look at that, Haas. I mean, look at that example, right? For a brief period of time, it created good revenue, partly because of all the hard work that everybody put into it, partly because of the creation of the idea, right, that you had, but also partly because of the algorithms. When the algorithms change, well then, it's easy to say, oh, I have less autonomy, that's why it happened. No, it happened because Facebook changed an algorithm.
I know, right? And what did I say throughout this entire process?
So that's why I actually think this is actually, Young Turks is actually a really poor example, because in a sense we have a lot more democracy than almost any company, right?
We used to have a lot more democracy, and it worked more successfully then, and that's the point I'm trying to make, and that's the point you would understand if you talk to like the people that actually work here, and not just the other executives.
Nonsense. I talk to everybody that works here.
I know, but they're not going to tell you because you're their boss, including like Anna and everyone else.
Right.
And look, listen. I'm not trying to like a pretty good boss in many ways, and you're inspirational, and that's part of the reason why a lot of people still work here, regardless of whether or not we have the benefits and offerings that we once had, or the same kind of freedom that we once had. But
every other company is way worse.
Of course, I know that's not an excuse. So obviously, that's another way that the system is designed.
Hans, this goes to the core of our intellectual argument, and we should get back to, which is there's hard realities. Like the way that you frame it, it sounds like, well, hey, if we do everything ideally, it's going to be rainbows. I know I'm being a jerk by saying it that way, but the bottom line is, if you run out of money, you are out of business. If you cannot run out of money.
Okay, during the creation of the breakdown, there were numerous instances where I gave warning signs to the executive team that Facebook volatility and ad revenue was so significant and that Facebook's algorithm could change that we should simply use this as a marketing tool and not necessarily a tool to generate revenue. And
but then how are you going to generate revenue?
Then no one listened to me.
Look, this is devolving into
for the past year or past almost year and a half, 2 years, I've been warning about this and saying that we need to move away from Facebook.
I think
if you were to listen to a person who actually works on the product a little bit more,
so
you're
accidentally making my point for me. Hans, there has to be a group of people that see the full picture and the full context, because you're seeing, understandably, through no fault of your own, a sliver of the reality of the entire situation, right? Whereas the quote unquote management team, et cetera, has to look at, okay, but what's our overall costs? What's our fixed costs? What's our variable costs? What are the other shows? What can we take from? What could we give to? What is the current environment? When you look at only a sliver of it and you vote in a democracy in a company based on that sliver, as much information as we try to give you guys, which is way more than almost any other company, even then your vote will be misinformed. That's why I actually don't love ballot measures. I don't like direct democracy because we do it here in California, and I go, how the hell would I know if we should spend more or less on highways? I don't know. How much are we spending? How much is it compared to the prisons? How much is it compared to the schools?
One has an immediate impact. It's like voting for what to eat in your family versus and like the benefits of that are immediate to you that you can realize very quickly versus like something entirely different and it's more complex that I still agree with, especially if we were able to better educate ourselves when we make those decisions and have more knowledge of what the implications are going to be. We're running out of time right now. This is the last minute. The last point I was going to make is, ironically, for the past couple of years, while I was talking about the warning signs of revenue, I said, we should move towards membership-driven programs because that's the only way to build a sustainable model.
And
so
hilariously,
here we are. Cenk, thank you so much for coming on. I don't think I did as aggressive. I wasn't as aggressive as I think you thought I was going to be. Ultimately, let's not forget that our short-term goals, our immediate goals are identical, and that you've done a tremendous amount of work in changing and reshaping the American democracy, and I'm very proud of you for that. And thank you for coming on.
Yeah, so my last point, guys, is I love this show.
All right.
I love the conversation that we had, and I think I learned from it. I hope you guys learned from it. Let's keep it going. Let's do more of these and try to tune in, because this is unlike what anyone else is doing. So if you like this experiment, you're all members already anyway. Keep it going, and we appreciate your support. And you want to talk about a democracy? We literally couldn't do it without you. You're voting with your money in a sense, so thank you.
All right, that'll be all for the first episode of Agitprop. Check us out at tyt.com/agitprop for more details. And that is all.